Hi, this is our Florida podcast. I'm Kaylee. On Mondays, I bring you a piece of Florida history, a cool story, a history of a specific location, like a state park. And on Fridays, my sister.
On Fridays, I talk about Florida's ecology and its unique wildlife.
All right. Well, today's going to be a little bit different, primarily because it's just one of those days. I don't have a proper mic. I don't have a proper camera. My printer ran out of ink. Someone decided to record extra early on the weekend that we lost an hour of sleep. So
woohoo, we're doing great. We're
winning over here. I do have a really cool topic that we're going to be going over today. And I struggled so much with trying to rein it in and figure out what are we going to talk about and to what extent. And I realized that I'm not a geologist. I should not try to be a geologist for all of you. So we're going to get probably a 5th grade level education on the Florida Springs today. Sound good?
I like it. Sounds good to me.
Right.
I too do not know geology.
Well, I knew we wanted to talk about springs today because of what we were going to be talking about on Friday. And I was like, well, there's so many springs, so, you can't talk about the history of all of them. And then as I started looking them up, I was like, oh, the springs are just like groundwater, but I don't know how it's formed. I know there's an aquifer. I just didn't know a lot of the things. And then I started looking it up and I was like, oh, we need to talk about every aspect of this. And I was like, that is so much information. Last night when I was learning more and more about plate tectonics, I was like, all right, we gotta rein it in. So Florida's geology is interesting and different from most of the U.S. 36 to 20 million years ago, the limestone bedrock formed that would make up Florida. So at the time, there's this warm, shallow sea, and then there's this limestone bedrock that's forming. And it's forming out of calcium carbonate, limestone carbonates. And it's mostly from animals that had died and their hard skeleton would attach there. So if you think the coquina, that's an example of that. And this is actually really similar to how the Bahamas and other areas in the Caribbean are formed. So we have got a little bit more in common with that than most of North America. Over millions of years, the hard skeletal body parts settled to the ocean floor, forming this limestone. During the last ice age, Florida was 3 times as wide and much drier. So in the grand scheme of the millions of years that Florida has existed in one way or the other, it's changed so much, and we're covering vast jumps of space just because there's not written history of this, and a lot of it is putting together different pieces because we find a fossil here, we've done dating here. So it's not okay, and then next 10 years and then the next 10 years. We're making massive leaps. So during the last ice age, which I believe was 20,000 years ago, Florida was going to be 3 times as wide and much drier. So it'd be more savanna-like. So think more like Africa.
Wow, okay.
And so at that time, too, it'd be home to all the megafauna. So mastodons, mammoths, giant armadillos, saber-toothed cats, giant tortoises, all the Ice Age animals were also in Florida, which is just crazy. And then we know, so 10 to 12,000 years ago, the first Paleo Indians arrive. So the first people that we know of are arriving in Florida, in theory. And then at that time, as people arrive, it seems that there's a mass extinction of all these giant animals. And there's a couple of things with that. There's a theory that when people arrive, they just killed all the animals, which we do know, part of this theory is because we find arrowheads in their skeletons and stuff. So obviously people are hunting them as much for food, as safety, as using their resources. But I don't know that it's fair to say that humans killed all of these giant animals, because at the same time, the Ice Age was ending and the world was heating up. The entire Earth was heating up. So with that, you've got all these ice caps melting, and just like today, but in much bigger quantities, you've got water rising. So instead of Florida being 3 times as wide as what it is, now it's coming down to more of the size that it is today, with a little bit of variation. And so Florida became much wetter. Everything kind of changes about it. We go from dry savanna to very wet, much more similar to today. And about 4 to 6,000 years ago, we know that the Everglades formed during this period.
That's cool.
Right? These changing sea levels really affected the topography of Florida. So like our slope and elevation, which, we always joke like there is no elevation.
There's none.
But technically the center of the state is a bit of a ridge. And that's because of these changing sea levels. So the central ridge of Florida, where it's higher, represents the ancient sand dunes. That's what we hiked through 2 weeks ago. So we're matching today. We have our I Did a Hike shirts because we did the Florida Trail hike. But the section that we were hiking through, you're hiking through these ancient sand dunes. And it is like walking, like if you're walking on a beach and you're going up and down in sand and all that. And then there were these large limestone formations. We'll post some pictures. Like this picture of Megan with trekking pole up and like the limestone is still taller than her, which is kind of crazy. Like I just didn't really.
It was really cool. Yeah.
But that's all because of those sea levels changing. So the sea comes in, the dunes come in, they form, and then eventually everything kind of evens out a little bit. The sea recedes, and we've got more of the topography that we have today. But it still leaves behind that limestone and the sand. Now, below the sea, Florida's platform that we talked about, that limestone that was starting to form millions of years ago, acts as a marine shelf. And as levels rise and as they lower, the calcium carbonate remains of sea creatures and algae form sedimentary limestone bedrock. Lots of big words. But basically, it's no different than like when you are at a dock and you see the post that goes into the water and you see like all the mollusks and stuff like stick to it. The same thing is happening to Florida, like underneath it. All these these little crustaceans are sticking to it. They die, and then they become part of the rock, and it just keeps compressing. So it's like the sedimentary rock made of all these little crustaceans. We're just walking around on the grave of little dead crustaceans. Told you not the super sciencey version, but we're gonna get the idea, okay?
Just super realistic.
Yeah.
We like it.
Now, so like as the water, that sea settles back down, some of that limestone's going to become exposed. And also it's all underground as well. And then fresh rainwater falls. And when it falls, it combines with carbon dioxide in the air. Like carbon dioxide is just a natural, it's what we breathe out. It's from our cars and all of that. But when it combines, it makes a carbonic acid. So it's slightly acidic now. And when it falls on the limestone's just like sedimentary. It's just like pieces of sand and calcium stuck together. So it starts to erode. And then it goes through.
Okay, so it starts to break it down.
Yeah, it's breaking it down. And it's going to break it down in all these different weird little paths. So that's why, like, if you look at a piece of limestone, it's got like all these different holes in it. Well, all of Florida is limestone. And it's going to have all these holes running through it in all these different places. So that is what's going to start to create the caves and sinkholes that we see.
Oh, that's so cool.
So it's like the rain fell, it was slightly acidic, it starts to wear these holes, and that's why, like, if you watch water flow through like a porous rock, it's going to go all these different directions. It's going to take the path of least resistance. And that's basically what's been happening to Florida for thousands and thousands of years. And this becomes the basis for the Florida Aquifer and the Florida Springs. So are you familiar with like the Floridan Aquifer at all?
Okay. No, I don't think so.
So like I have a very tenuous grasp of this. And I was like, okay, so I know there's the aquifer. It's under Florida. An aquifer, it basically refers to like a large storage of water, but it's like a natural storage of water. So it's being stored in that limestone underneath. And the Florida aquifer is actually very large. It extends for most of the full Florida peninsula and into southeast Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And it's the main source of fresh water in North Florida and South Georgia / Alabama. It's not the largest, but it is one of the most productive. So it has like some of the most water getting pushed out of it. It's estimated that the Floridan Aquifer holds over 1 trillion gallons of water, which is like a number I can't even truly comprehend, honestly.
No, you can't like fathom that.
So the springs actually form when groundwater is forced up onto the surface because of rainwater and groundwater coming through the rock, and it creates pressure, and then it forces this other water up. Make sense?
Yeah.
So it was so frustrating to me because I'm researching, and they like started to talk about the water cycle. And I'm like, yeah, I get the water cycle. And then you get to like the spring part, and you're like, wait, what happened? And it's so like you've got the rain falls after condensation, etc. Rain falls, it runs into the groundwater, but all of that groundwater is slowly draining into the aquifer. And like all this is working because of gravity, you know, everything wants to go down. So groundwater seeps down, rainwater seeps down, it finds those holes in the rock, it gets into the aquifer, storing it. A lot of the water that's in the aquifer is actually from like, you know, billions of years ago. And a lot of the water that's in the aquifer is not all fresh water. Some of it is saltwater too, which I was trying to figure that I was like, okay, but if the ocean's there, like Florida's not that deep, how do you keep saltwater out of the aquifer? Saltwater is in the aquifer. The saltwater is just more dense, so it goes to the bottom, and then the fresh water stays more up on top. That's part of why the aquifer is mostly used in North Florida and Georgia for drinking water, because the aquifer in South Florida, like part of the Floridan aquifer in South Florida, is really, really salty, actually. So it's not good for drinking water. So there's a lot of factors that go into like why some places in Florida have a spring if like this aquifer extends all the way. Like why aren't there springs everywhere? Why is the water in the south more salty, or to further east, why is it too salty to use? And there's so many different factors that go into it. Has to do a little bit with like how far down the aquifer is ground level wise, but then also they call it confined. It depends on how confined the water is. So if you have a section that has a lot of clay or really thick rock, then there's no path for that water to get up to the top. Where it's least confined is where you have most of the springs and sinkholes, because there's more of a path for that water. So the water comes in from the groundwater from the rain, and then it changes the pressure and it pushes the water out in these less confined places where it's not being blocked by impermeable clay or really thick layers of rock. And that's what forms your springs. Sinkholes are a little bit different, like we talked about deep hole in your alligator episode. Sinkholes are a little bit different. It's more of like a opening into the ground, and it's not so much that the water is being pushed up, but it's all connected to that same aquifer or different aquifers. Like it's still all the same groundwater, which I didn't get that before. The springs and like the sinkholes in the center of the state are all part of the Floridan aquifer, but the one has pressure exerted on it, which is causing that water to be pushed out, whereas the other is just an opening into that water, and the water comes up with less pressure, with less speed.
Okay, so when you say it's all part of the aquifer, what does that entail?
What do you mean?
You just said that all these things are all part of the aquifer, and I don't understand how.
So the aquifer is underneath, like, the ground that we are on. The aquifer is underneath that, and it's extending all the way from like South Florida, most of the peninsula, all the way up to Georgia and Alabama, and it's this like limestone network of water underneath. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does it?
No, I'm looking at the picture right now.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's like this it's like a massive underground network of all this water. This like cistern of water.
And this goes through how much of Florida?
Basically all of it.
Okay, so what's below that then?
Below that is
It's the rock?
It's like rock and then ocean, I believe.
This seems crazy. Alright, let me recap this real quick here.
Alright, we're gonna make a recap.
So an aquifer, let me recap this, because if I'm up this early, I might as well actually really understand what we're talking about today. So an aquifer is a body of rock, or it's a rock, limestone, sediment, whatever we want to call it. You have the rock. You guys get, you can kind of see, I'm kind of talking my hands right now, but you have the rock. That rock holds water underneath. And because limestone and the rock have different holes and things, and I don't know. I really don't know.
So,
yeah, I don't know.
In quick summary, you got like your ground and groundwater. So it's like your lakes and ponds and stuff at the top. That's the ground. Underneath that, you have this limestone bedrock, which is this really like porous rock made of all these like dead crustaceans over the years. And so in that, there's like a chasm or a hole. Essentially, the limestone's kind of made a container that holds water, and that holding of the water is the aquifer. Below that, there's more bedrock, and below that, I believe, is like the ocean. And then you get into like the layers of earth. So the aquifer just refers to this container that's like this natural limestone container that's holding all of this water.
Okay, so the aquifer is not even a little, it's not man-made. It's completely natural, just off what Florida is made off of.
So yeah, so like that's holding the water. And when water comes in from the rain, it's pushing it out in other places because the pressure is so great. And that's what's forming the spring that's pushing water out.
So definitely not the takeaway from this, but it kind of sounds that like it would take a lot for Florida to become a drought or go in like a drought season.
Yes and no. Like we have a ton of rainwater, but it's also really important that the aquifer continues to have water
to replenish.
And a lot of the water that was in there, it's been put in after like millions and millions of years. So if we are pulling more than we can put in, then we're going to have a major problem.
Then that would be.
And that is actually a concern for Florida. Is like, it used to be agriculture pulled so much water, and now it's become residential as like one of the number one uses of that fresh water. And like I was saying too, like the salt water sinks to the bottom. So the aquifer has trillions of gallons of water, but it's not all drinkable.
Yeah, so it's not something that's okay. Yeah.
So it's like, yes and no. It's one of those weird things like, yeah, we're not the desert. We're not Arizona. We're not in immediate danger of drought. But as things get hotter, as, you know, the ocean levels rise, we have more saltwater intrusion. Like there is definitely a need to still be aware of water consumption in Florida. And yeah, just be mindful of that at bare minimum. Yeah. So that all brings me to our topic for, well, I mean, this was all part of the topic, but topic for today specifically is Wakulla Springs. Wakulla Springs, or the Gem of Northeast Florida, is a first magnitude spring. And what that means is that there's 4 different magnitude levels of springs, and that has to do with how much water it's being pushed out. So first magnitude is the highest level, like the most water is being pushed out of those. So Silver Springs is an example of like a first magnitude spring. And then Wakulla is an example. I believe there are about 30 or 31 first magnitude springs in the state of Florida.
That's cool.
And you've actually been to Wakulla Springs before.
Is that the one that we went to as a kid, but we didn't touch the water? Because that's the only one I don't remember. So I'm assuming it's that one.
Like, I blocked it out because I didn't get to go swimming.
Well, yeah, I think that was like our first time getting to go to this. Like, I think we had been to Rainbow Springs and stuff. Or at least I had, I think. But that was like our first spring. I know we got to see the water. And it was pretty.
Yeah, we had gone to Silver Springs and done the glass bottom boat tours the year before. And you had done Rainbow River with some friends. But Wakulla Springs, I forgot you'd done Rainbow River with some springs. But yeah, Wakulla is the one that we stopped at. It's a great place to stop if you're heading into the Panhandle. Which brings me to its location. It is located in Northwest Florida. It is about 15 miles south of Tallahassee. It's like a 23-minute drive, so super, super close to Tallahassee. And it's known as the Gem of Northwest Florida. It's actually one of the largest and deepest freshwater springs in the world. So at its vent to surface of water, it's 185 feet deep.
Wow.
I've actually gone back and swam in it. I mean, kind of swam. So if you haven't been to the springs, Florida Springs are really, really cool. And I definitely recommend going and checking out like one of these. Any size spring is amazing. But these first magnitude springs are just ridiculously insane. The amount of water that's coming up, and if you like try to swim above it or anything, it like will push you out. A lot of not all of them. Silver Springs you can't swim in, but Wakulla I'm pretty sure you can swim in. I don't know how close you can get to the vent. I don't remember. But a lot of them you can like swim down and start to see. Obviously 185 feet, you're not swimming that far down without specialized training. But my husband Jared, like, he's a fish. He loves like swimming, and he'll dive like 20, 30 feet down and like try to get close. For me, I love seeing the springs, but they're what my nightmares are made of. This idea, like this hole in the ground, like opening up, and it's gives me so much anxiety of being in the water. So I am one of the people with like a little floaty, or even I put my life jacket on. I can swim, but I'll put my life jacket on and like paddle over just above the opening and look and like, oh, okay, that's cool. Scoot back.
She takes a peek.
I take a peek and then I go back.
Me
no
too.
shame in that at all. But for all of our mermen and merladies out there, I'm very happy for you. It seems like a really fun thing to do, swim down and like check out the springs. But that one it's crazy too because the water that's coming out of there is so crystal clear and beautiful. You are looking down and it looks like it could only be like 20 feet and it's like 185 feet. So it's a very wild experience. Highly recommend.
Yeah, you have absolutely no, like, well, I won't say everyone, but like typically you have like absolutely no awareness of the depth that's like actually in front of you. Like, it will look like, okay, I could totally just go stand on that rock over there, because a lot of times there's like rocks or different trees and stuff that are laying there, and it's like, well, actually, no, that's like several feet down, and you're not touching
Yeah,
that.
exactly. I think that's what gets me, and you can see it if you're watching the video. You can see it in my face. I'm getting like, whoo. I'll put the snorkel on and I'll go to look, and highly recommend if you're going to be at any springs, bring a snorkel because it's so cool what you
Bring
can
a
see.
snorkel.
You'll see turtles, you'll see fish, you'll see like the gar and stuff swimming around. Absolutely worth it. But you're like, oh, that's a rock. I could maybe go stand on that rock. And then you're like paddling and you look over and you see where your feet are in relation to the top of that rock. And it's just massive. And that's not for me. I don't know what the name of that fear is. If you know, let us know. Drop it in the comments. But woo, not for me. But the springs are gorgeous. Check them out. Just like most of our springs in Florida, the water coming out of here is going to be 72 degrees. And that's because it's that groundwater. It's going to be kept at that constant temperature. It's coming from underneath. So it's not affected by like, oh, it's super hot or it's super cold. The ground is keeping it at that stable temperature. So it's 72 degrees. So in the summer, it's wonderful and cold. If you go to the springs when it's below 72 degrees, the water feels great. And then it's just when you get out of the water and the air hits you that you're like, oh my gosh.
Very cold.
Very cold. But this one is a first magnitude, so it's one of the largest. Some sources say the largest. I don't know. I don't know how they measure that exactly. And I just found conflicting information. But certainly one of the largest, incredibly notable. It discharges about 300 million gallons of water per day, or 400 gallons per minute, which once again, like, I appreciate the 400 gallons analogy because like I can kind of picture what 400 gallons of water looks like, but I still like all of 400 gallons of water per minute.
I still, like, you can't fathom or understand like what that's actually doing. Like,
well, and that water source feeds the full Wakulla River, which stretches about 11 miles. And it's been known for years that people have lived around the spring for at least 10 to 12,000 years. But hold on to that number because we're going to come back to it. In the mid-1400s, it's estimated that there were nearly 50,000 Appalachian, like the native tribes living in Florida's Big Bend area. And the Big Bend area is exactly what it sounds like. It's it's the armpit area in the Panhandle. So 50,000 people there. And that's before European settlers arrive. So 1528, first Europeans arrive and explore the springs. There's actually a large Appalachian hamlet known as Aute. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But they've got like their own like town stuff. Like people have been settled here. It's evident that there has been people and civilization here for a while. So a Spanish fort was built there during the first Spanish period. And this area follows a similar history to like what we were talking about in our Fort Mose episode, where you've got the first Spanish period. There's a fort built there. There's a little bit of collaboration between some of the native Appalachian or Yamasee tribes and the Spanish. There's Spanish missionaries being set up. And then you also are going to have raids from British patrols coming through, trying to destroy the missions and everything, because there's still at this time, there's a very strong Protestant versus Catholic thing happening. Britain still owns everything north. Spain has Florida. So you've got that going on. But unlike St. Augustine, where like when Fort Mose was taken out, everyone retreated to St. Augustine, this massive fort, there's not a massive fort there. So it's just kind of like wiped out for a little bit. At the end of the first Spanish period, most everyone that was there either moved with the Spanish to Cuba, they got out, or Britain came in and made people slaves if they stuck around and stuff. We know that there was at least one British slaver that like set up an absentee plantation over in that area by the springs. So basically like he wasn't there, but he had people overseeing it and people working it. After the Revolutionary War, we have the second Spanish period. So same thing. It's just kind of following that fluctuation pattern that we saw in St. Augustine. So you've got the Spanish back in there, and then it becomes a U.S. territory for about 20 years before it actually becomes a state. And then Florida becomes a state in 1845. And that's just really significant because, like, as far as like where Wakulla is, because Wakulla is only 15 miles south of Tallahassee, and Tallahassee is our state capital. So a lot of these decisions and stuff are happening around there. In the mid 1800s, tourism ramps up more. But in 1850, Sarah A. Smith identified mastodon bones in the spring basin. So I'm going to have you look up Mastodon History Museum. You can see the bones that were there. I also really want to know more about this lady because, like, I don't think about 1850s women, like, identifying mastodon bones. So I'm very curious, but it was really hard to find any more information about it than that.
Okay. Am I looking at the Aucilla River?
Wakulla.
Okay, cool.
You see the picture of the mastodon skeleton?
Whoa, I do now. Right? That's cool.
I looked at mastodons are like somewhere between an elephant and a woolly mammoth. I think they're a little more on the woolly mammoth side. They had straighter tusks and shorter hair, which makes sense being a little bit closer to the equator and stuff. So yeah, those were found identified in 1850. We also know, so like you got the Civil War, and then after that, we know that there is a Black community in the area that was thriving. They also seem to have been there since the first Spanish period. So remember when we were talking in Fort Mose, how there were these different communities that like retreated into the woods and were self-sufficient? It seems like the community there was like that. And then obviously after slaves were freed, it built up and thrived even more. We know that the local Black churches were using these springs for baptisms, which someone that got baptized in a cow trough in a cow pasture, a little jealous. Not that that's how that's supposed to work. But, you know, that's beautiful. And, you know, there's tourism and everything happening too. And that's when you have the first reports of glass-bottom boats being used. And it was, like local Black businesses basically setting up tour companies with these boats that they then cut out the bottom and sealed a window pane into, making their glass bottom boats, and then they take people out there for money and paddle them around so you can look down and see the spring, which of course is nice because you can see it without having to get into the cold water or be terrified of the chasm opening up the earth. Yeah. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
So in 1931, those mastodon bones were removed, which kind of crazy to me. Like 1930s, that seems like a huge effort.
That's not too far along. Yeah, that also doesn't feel like that long ago either.
Yeah, they were almost 100 years.
Yeah.
The bones were removed and put on display at the Museum of Florida History in Tallahassee, which I definitely want to go to now. Wasn't aware of that. And this whole process was actually even captured on film. It was like the first time that underwater film had happened for this like news company that did it. Not like had happened at all, but the news company that filmed it, that was like one of the first times that had been done for them. In 1934, Edward Ball purchased the land around the spring to develop a lodge. So now I'm going to have you look up pictures of the Wakulla Lodge. So in 1937, the lodge is developed. It's made in this Spanish style, very big, tall ceilings, lots and lots and lots of marble. So it was like Tennessee marble. It was all imported.
It's pretty.
It's very pretty. The marble that they used was cut so perfectly that everything fits so well. You don't see grout marks. Yeah. And then a lot of the timber that was used was made out of heart cypress. So the heartwood is like the center of the cypress, and they used dead cypress, I believe is what it's called. And it was cypress trees that had been in the water for like 50 plus years, making it impervious to rot. So they pulled that, it's, first of all, it's gorgeous. Cypress wood is beautiful, but then it's also like naturally sealed basically. And that's what like a lot of the ceilings are made. The artwork in the ceilings has all these pictures of wildlife and birds, all these different scenes. They have a soda shop, like an old school candy soda shop that has a 70-foot marble countertop, which is made from the same slab of marble, which I was confused by this at first. But basically, it's not that it's a 70-foot piece. It's that this one large chunk was like split in half several times to then make 70 feet. And I guess however they do it, and once again, not a geologist. I don't know what I was trying to do this episode, but not a geologist. However they do that, it makes a continuous grain pattern. So that's like the longest piece of continuous.
So it looks like it's just
Yeah,
one.
that's my
That's
understanding.
so cool.
But definitely sounds so cool, like going into this old school soda shop, this 1930s Spanish style lodge. You can definitely still stay there. And
yeah, it looks like they do like big events. They'll do weddings now and stuff too. Looking at a picture of it, it's really pretty.
I know, I'm like, I'm usually like a camp person. Like I can go camping. We redid our minivan so we can sleep in it. Like we don't spend money on hotels kind of people, but the more I like see some of these historic lodges, I'm like, ooh, I could do that. That could be fun. Just one night. Then we go camping.
That could be cool.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
But yeah, so that was like, and then of course that brought in a lot of tourism. There's like pictures of these girls in bathing suits, like all standing on top of the Wakulla sign pointing. In 1943, World War II had started, and there's amphibious training happening at the spring. And I guess at one point too, like there was fire from like some soldiers being careless. So like some of the heart cypress got burned and stuff, but that all got like fixed. In 1941, Tarzan is filmed at the Springs, and then in coming years, there'd be other movies like Creatures of the Black Lagoon, Joe Panther, and Airport 77. Have you seen any of those?
No, I don't think so. I'm not a huge movie.
I'm not either. I'm not a like movie buff. In 1981, Ball passed away, so he left his land to a wildlife refuge, and then it was eventually bought and made into a state park in 1986. So about 5 years later. And then from there, the state park, or like the state, continued to buy land from different areas around there to connect it, make it larger, which is important too with the springs. I think it's really easy to be like, well, the spring's protected because there's a park there. But the water that feeds into that spring that we were talking about, that groundwater, comes from miles and miles and miles and miles around. So the health of your spring does not depend on like, oh, well, there's not a Walmart right next
the
to
spring
it.
itself, it's what's surrounding
Exactly.
it.
So having large state parks and state forests that are protected is extremely important to like the overall health of the springs and the aquifer and our drinking water. In the last 30 to 40 years, there have been massive discoveries in the area. A team of divers mapped out 72 kilometers or 44.7 miles of cave systems in the Wakulla Springs.
What? That's cool.
Crazy. Like, so they're going down, they're going into these caves, and they've mapped out 44 miles, which is like one of the largest spring-fed cave systems in the world. Now, yeah,
That's cool.
National Geographic like paid to do a whole film thing here. I actually haven't watched it yet, but I really want to. They've been doing more of this mapping and discovering of the different areas of the spring itself, and also the Wakulla River and the Wakulla River that like feed into this area. They have found so many more fossils and so much more archaeological evidence of people living here for thousands on thousands of years. So they have found more mastodons. They have found evidence of like the giant tortoises, giant armadillos. They have found more evidence of like these giant armadillos. They found arrowheads within the animals, so showing that for sure people were here interacting with these giant animals, which is just insane. Can you imagine like living in a world walking around with all these giant armadillos?
I want to see a giant armadillo.
Do you though? Like, I mean,
yes
yeah.
and no.
No, I agree. It's same thing.
Yes and no.
And because at the time too, like when all these things, you gotta remember Florida was like 3 times as wide. So this was land or like caves and stuff. So they found all that, and they've actually found evidence that backs up the time that people were here to about 14,500 years ago. So remember before we were like, okay, probably for sure 12,000 years. They added an extra 2,500 years to that. That's pretty
cool.
crazy.
It's
Yeah,
impressive.
that's like, it's been 2,000 years of like, we have record of like the last 2,000 years. So like that, there's a lot of things that could change in that time.
Wow.
So that's pretty wild. And part of like finding all of this stuff has made this site a National Historic and Archaeological District, which is really cool and really great for like helping protect it. So yeah, it's pretty cool. You have any questions or any thoughts?
So when I was looking at pictures of Wakulla Springs, it looks like they have just a giant swimming hole. But I don't remember the giant swimming hole. I remember it was like just a lot smaller. Like it was just, I know we only probably saw like a section of it. I remember like a part. Do you remember like the part that we saw?
So the memories kind of blend because I went back and did it with Jared. So it's hard to
Yeah.
separate like what I remember seeing the first time and then what I remember seeing when I actually like got in. But I know that they've got a big swimming area. They actually have like a diving platform in one section too. And
Yeah.
like the diving platform's not anywhere near the spring mouth. It's just like in the spring fed water and river because like all of this is going out into the river. So like I think you can kayak up along the river, but you have to like get out and walk into the spring area. So, but there's a decent
Okay.
swimming area for everybody. Yeah. Over the years,
Of all this,
go ahead.
out of all the springs you've been to, where do you rate this one? We've been to a decent
We
amount.
have been to a decent amount. I think it just depends on what you're rating on. As far as like first magnitude that you can swim in that I've been to, like this is so you got like the two first magnitude springs I've been to has been this one in Silver Springs. Silver Springs is excellent paddling, but you can't swim. Which, as someone who's a little freaked out by the springs, doesn't really bother me. I like just paddling around and looking down and like, oh, there's a gator, there's this. But for Jared, who like lives for swimming in the springs, I think he'd probably rank Wakulla higher than Silver Springs.
Okay, that makes sense.
Stripes
Yeah,
against
I can see
Wakulla is
that.
that every time I've been, it's been pretty busy because it's
It's
very
very
busy.
busy,
But I
yeah.
mean, it's gorgeous. It's gonna be. It's great. As far as like, I love Seven Sisters. It's a little bit smaller, a little hole in the wall. Also, I can stand the whole time. I feel like I'm not the best person to ask about this because I'm like, I mean, they're cool, but I don't really want to swim. I want to like paddle over or like stand there with my snorkel on and look. I'm such a dork in the water, guys. I mean,
Well, I think for reference, I think we're bigger kayakers than
yeah,
we are.
but
Because I don't swim the worst, so I guess really the sense of like pretty water, and I like seeing all the fish. I love seeing all the fish. So like typically I would be like, oh, I pick Seven Sisters, but that's mostly because I've seen the most fish at Seven Sisters or at the one by
I
my
think there's a little
place.
bit of a.
Just
Oh
because I
yeah,
like seeing all the
yeah.
fish.
That one's Wakaiba is really beautiful.
Okay, yeah.
I think Seven Sisters works nicely too because it's the closest to me, or at least closest I've been to. That's like near us. We go there a lot. It was like one of my first like dates and outings, so it's got like fond memories. But also it's good because I can stand there and look and have a great time, and Jared can swim through the caves, which is like a little challenge and fun. We'll do an episode on Seven Sisters at some point, and we're definitely going to dive into a lot more of these springs because all of them have really unique stories.
And a field trip to Silver Spring.
We do need a field trip to Silver Springs and kayak the Silver River. It's beautiful. So yeah, that's what I would say. Now, Wakulla has faced a couple different like struggles over the years, as such like most of our springs do. They've had issues with invasive plants, including like this grass from Sri Lanka that was like really taking over. There's overconsumption of water. It used to be that agriculture pulled the most water in Florida, and now it's households. And as more houses go in, it's going to continue to be that way. So it is really important to like, even though we are surrounded by water here, to still conserve it and keep in mind that like it's a finite resource in a lot of ways. Like water is renewable, yes, but as we're like facing changing weather patterns and stuff, if we're pulling too much and we're using too much and we're tainting too much of the water with like runoff from roads or excess nitrogen from farms, oils and stuff from roads, then like we're going to mess ourselves up. It might not be our generation, but it could be our kids, grandkids, like someone's going to have to deal with that problem if we are not careful now. It's also really important to make sure that like if you have paint cans and stuff that you dispose of that properly, because if that ends up in there, it can really cause a lot of issues. And like I said, it can mess up. If you get enough of these things like the nitrogen stuff, it's going to hurt the aquifer overall. But yeah, I think that is about it for what I want to cover. Be sure to look if any of that, like, you're like, oh, I really want to see the lodge, look it up, check it out. The archaeological stuff that's happening there is ongoing and really, really interesting. I think it's like one of the sites of like evidence of like ancient people in Florida, which is just really, really cool. I gotta go to that museum and see the mastodon bones. That just seems so otherworldly.
Yeah, that seems so
Yeah.
cool.
And this place is a great spot if you're in Tallahassee, because it's just a 30-minute drive down. All you need is a swimsuit. Like, you don't need any specialized equipment. I would say bring goggles or a snorkel, but you don't have to do the kayak rental. Oh, and they also do glass bottom boat tours as well. So if you're like,
They do it there too.
So if you don't want to get wet, or if it's like really cold, or I would say if it's excessively hot, but if it's excessively hot, get in the water. But if you're there and it's really cold and you're like, no, I'm not doing it, they have the glass bottom boat tours as well. So, all right, guys. Well, I think that's going to be it for today then. Thank you for joining us. You can like, follow, subscribe anywhere on social media at Our Florida Podcast. If you want to tell me how wrong I got the geology, you can email me at ourfloridapodcast@gmail.com. But please be nice. I'm doing my best. And if you learned something today, please share with others. Let us know your thoughts. If you have any cool stories at the springs, what's your favorite spring? Send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Meg, you want to give us a teaser for what you're going to be talking about on Friday?
Yeah, so we are going to be talking about a marine life animal that heavily requires the springs for refuge in our winter months. So,
all right.
take your best guess.
All right, guys. We'll see you on Friday. Thanks so much. Bye.